Welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda. My name is Nick Park. I'm taking us through a series of messages where we see how Jesus is the centre of every book of the Old Testament. Of course, we know he's the centre of the New Testament, but many of us don't realise that he is the centre of the Old Testament as well. And we're now in the book of Leviticus. And the book of Leviticus, for many people, it's the hardest book in the Bible to read. I remember when I first got saved, I did not come from a background of much biblical knowledge. And so I had to start reading the Bible through. And I started at Genesis. And what I used to do, I had a job where I could actually sit and read all night long, 9-10 hours at a time. And I would just start in Genesis and I would read. And if there was something I didn't understand, I would get down on my knees and I would pray and ask the Holy Spirit to give me understanding. Now Genesis, Exodus, they were pretty well okay, but once I got into Leviticus, I was spending more time on my knees praying than I was actually reading, because I didn't really understand any of it. You know, there's all these laws and endless details of sacrifices and everything else. Now, to really understand the book of Leviticus, you need to understand the book of Hebrews. And it really is like the New Testament fulfills the Old Testament, but very often there's one book of the New Testament that helps us to understand a particular Old Testament book. I find with Genesis, for example, it really links together in so many ways with the book of Revelation, because lots of things that are started in Genesis finish in Revelation. And it's the same way with Leviticus and Hebrews. The book of Hebrews explains so much of the stuff that is in the book of Leviticus. And it points out that this old system of law and sacrifices was imperfect because it was temporary. They had to keep repeating the sacrifices again and again. And the reason for that was the second problem, is that old system of sacrifices in the temple, in the Jewish temple, could not take away sin. It could only point forwards to the one who would really take away sin. And of course, that is Jesus. And so they were a signpost. This Old Testament law and the sacrifices and the priesthood and everything else, they were signposts pointing to something else, or rather to someone else, and that was Jesus Christ. Now in Leviticus chapter 8 we read about the high priest, and that the high priest had a job to do. The high priest was there to appear before God on behalf of the people as a mediator and to offer sacrifices. But Hebrews, again, the book of Hebrews tells us that we have a perfect, permanent high priest. You know, these high priests, they lived, they died, they were replaced by another one. But Jesus is our great high priest, our perfect and permanent high priest. And just as in the Old Testament, the high priest had to be anointed with oil, and there was a beautiful psalm in the book of Psalms about that, where there's unity, the Lord commands blessing. It's like the oil flowing down on Aaron when he was anointed as high priest. Well, in the same way, Jesus had to be anointed. Jesus had to have the Holy Spirit on him to fulfill his calling as the great high priest. And we actually read Jesus saying this in the book of Luke, whenever he said this. Jesus said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." So just as the high priest was anointed with oil, our great high priest was empowered by the Holy Spirit to fulfill his ministry. And because he's the perfect high priest, we don't need any more high priests. Jesus is our perfect, permanent high priest, because the book of Leviticus, all the stuff about the high priest, was really pointing the way to Jesus, because Jesus is the center of the book of Leviticus. Today I thank God we have such a high priest that will never fail, will never fade, will never need replaced. Jesus, our prophet, priest and king. God bless you today. Join us again tomorrow for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda.